All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. My name is Trisha Curtis. I am the CEO of PetroNerds and the host of the PetroNerds podcast. And today is Tuesday, July 5th, 2022. So it's a happy 4th to everyone out there. It was a long and fun weekend, but we opened up the markets today with the markets down. But this is episode 51 of the PetroNerds podcast, and I am joined with an awesome and very exclusive guest with a company called U.S. Strategic Minerals. And this is you're the CEO or the COO of U.S. Strategic Minerals, Thomas Smith, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, pretty much dual role.
Awesome.
I pretty much lead the team. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's great to have you.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be on with you. Ran into you last week at the Hearts Doug. It was great to meet you in person, and looking forward to today.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we will recap that a little bit. I'd love to talk a little bit about the Doug presentation and that I gave and just the conference bit, because I think today, and so U.S. Strategic Minerals, we're going to get into it in just a second and let Thomas explain, in 30 seconds what it is and what they're trying to do. But the markets, down, Dow is down. The recession fears are pretty rampant. If you pull up the front page of Bloomberg and you just look at what's going on Bloomberg, it's recession. Same for CNBC, it's recession. Oil prices are down, natural gas prices are up, and we have these very unique dynamics playing out in the market of the dollar is obviously on tearing on highs right now, which is pressuring oil prices down, and we're seeing the dollar at near parity to the euro. So lots going on with the market. But setting that aside for just a moment, again, this is episode 51, Tuesday, July 5th, 2022. So Thomas, can you tell us a little bit what, in a nutshell, in 30 seconds, what is U.S. Strategic Minerals?
Well, we're a kind of a hybrid between oil and gas and mining. And right now we're looking to mine brines using the drill bit. So we've used our team's expertise in oil and gas and exploration over the last, we have over 40 years each, and trying to think outside of the barrel and use what we've learned over our careers and apply them to the current supply chain issue with critical minerals. Specifically to our prospect in Utah would be lithium. So actually mine lithium out of a brine source that normally in an oil and gas world would be a dry hole. So someone that they put a bit in the dirt and they go after oil and gas and they hit water, they're typically going to go ahead and plug that well out and never complete it. But by putting a mining claim over that surface location, you can actually extract minerals. You have a right to develop those minerals.
Okay, so that's the business in a nutshell, which there's a lot of questions. So I have a lot of different things, and I'm going off a couple presentations that you sent me, so some sort of decks of your business and what you're doing, and we've talked beforehand. So the reason I think this is relevant and why it's relevant, I think, to podcast listeners is that I talk about China quite a bit on the podcast. I talk about geopolitics and everything, and so rare earth minerals, which are not necessarily that rare, but it's that what we call rare earth minerals, but critical minerals and metals in general, like as you put aluminum. I think it's that you list several of them, from the Geologic Survey or from U.S. Geologic Survey, USGS. But then you highlight several of these that you could actually get through brine water, which is aluminum, lithium, magnesium, rubidium, and yttrium and zinc. And so I want to come back to those of sort of, what your business wants to do and how you can get those minerals and some of the pricing. But I actually forgot to cap this podcast and say this was WTI is $98. We actually touched $97 just a little bit ago. Brent is 101.69. Nat gas is 546. We are seeing a Dutch TTF on an absolute tear on the upward side at $45. And the 30-year mortgage rate is under 6%. We're seeing 10-year treasury yields have come down considerably. And we're seeing these 2-year and 5-year treasury yields go a little crazy, which is why people are super worried about recession, which is actually quite relevant to what we're talking about here, because I would say, with this administration, with a lot of the policies that have been taking place, Paris Climate Accords, lots of things listed within the Climate Change Executive Order 14008, the need for, or the desires to actually green up the grid or reduce the emissions significantly on the U.S. grid to make it net zero by 2035 would require an excessive amount of wind turbines and solar panels, and would also have, there's a hope, obviously, that there's a lot of infrastructure development for battery technology. And where I think you play, I mean, obviously lithium and several of these other things are critical, in aluminum, but are sort of critical in the sphere of, you can't build this, we can't build this stuff without this. And almost all of it, the entire, almost 80% of the battery market globally is cornered by China, as is the solar market, and a significant amount of wind turbines as well. Partly because so much of these rare earth minerals, or these critical minerals, are not only owned, but they're also extracted, but also processed by China. So you're offering a solution as a company that, we can talk about where you're at the stages of the development of this, that you can actually go after brine water and extract this stuff, such as lithium, from the brine water. But this is not from produced brine water from a wellhead. You're actually going into a wellbore, and you're actually going into the ground, and you're extracting this brine water and doing it that way. So can you break that up a little bit and explain, it's not the produced water, it's actually going after the well, and where are you sort of doing this, and what kind of technology are you using?
Well, so we actually are going after existing sources of geothermal brine. So let's just say, for example, in North Dakota, a lot of the produced waters up there, in the Bakken, Three Forks, in Mission Canyon, even from back in the old water flood days, they're moving a lot of water. The average water cut's going to be north of 90%. And that's pretty common with almost all the major producing basins, including the Permian. So let's just say you're moving 9 times as much water to get that 10% of the oil. In historically, that 10% of the oil and any associated gas pretty much had to drive the economics. In other words, get the rate of return and the metrics that are required to put the capital down to drill the well. So we offer a bridge and basically say our technology can find value by mining the brine that you're already collecting and removing from the oil. And before you re-inject it down into the ground to dispose of it, or in your water flood or your EOR flood, your CO2 flood, let us take let us plug in and inject some CO2 with our proprietary processes, and actually can sequester CO2 by a process called ex situ mineral carbonation. And so you're essentially making limestone and other dolomite type minerals that nature does. We're just accelerating that. We're doing that on steroids. We're basically saying we're going to take pure CO2 instead of the 0.045% that's in nature, in the atmosphere, right, that we're all concerned about. And we're going to do this on steroids. We're going to actually precipitate this within an hour, make aggregate, and that qualifies for a Section 45Q carbon sequestration project.
Okay, but so you're sequestering carbon from water that's been produced, but how are you mining? Right. You have multiple. Then you're also mining the minerals from that water, but you're also mining it when you're actually going and drilling for the water. So first, let's, and if I'm getting those two buckets right, so why don't you explain how do you mine those minerals, and how much you're actually getting from produced water, and how does that work? Is the regulatory environment around water is quite tricky. I mean, it's one of those reasons that people always want to talk about, why don't we use more produced water? I mean, several years ago, we weren't actually using a ton of produced water in fracking because it just wasn't known. It wasn't well known. And then when oil prices dropped in 2014, lo and behold, you realize that everyone thought they needed fresh water, but produced water, they could make produced water work. But part of it was the regulatory side hadn't caught up. So you couldn't just pick up this water and move it around really easily. I mean, yes, you could clean it up, but we have so much produced water, not just in North Dakota, but particularly obviously in the Permian, where the cut of water is massive. So you have to do something with it. So even if we fracked every single well with produced water, we still have a crap ton of water left over. So I think understanding of how, one, if you have any thoughts and stuff on this, on the regulatory side of how you move this stuff around, how you can actually treat it, and what then you can do with it. And two, where does your first part of your business of your mining, these minerals out of that produced water, how does that work?
Okay, so you're exactly correct. In each state, in the feds versus the state is different. The Permian's a little bit different animal. We've been looking mainly At Utah, a lot of federal lands, also state lands, and state and federal in Utah is kind of our primary prospect, is in the northern Paradox Basin. So, the Paradox Basin is really historically been a mineral rich basin, not just for oil and gas, but merely for things like potash, lithium. There's several companies operating in the area and actually trying to get lithium out of brines as we are. But realistically, lithium, and you know this as well as I do, is lithium doesn't ever get concentrated. It's always going to be in a very low concentration, whether it's in the dirt in Nevada that Elon Musk wants to mine, and in the brines as well. I mean, 200 parts per million to 250 parts per million is really all you're going to ever see is lithium as a chloride in the brine, whereas calcium and magnesium can be as high as 135,000 parts per million. And when I say calcium and magnesium, those are the two elements that tend to like CO2, and those are the backbone of creating carbon sequestrated products, and those are the alkaline earth elements, calcium carbonate and magnesium carbonate. Because of the volume and the scale, you can actually move the needle with carbon sequestration by targeting minerals in these brines like calcium and magnesium that are in high concentration. So we have kind of a model that says when we bring something out of the ground, we're going to look at all these different revenue streams that are associated with this brine that comes with the oil and gas. And because oil and gas operates under RCRA, which is basically says that it's a hazardous waste. That's
Just
why you
hold
could
on.
never
What
use.
is
You can't just move brine around.
yeah. So why don't you just for listeners who may not know what is RCRA? I don't know that's obviously not RCRA, and then
Well,
maybe actually a decent. I know a lot of folks know what brine water is, but actually how you would define it, I think two of those would be awesome to hear.
right. So what we call RCRA is a regulatory. It's been around since OPA 90. I mean, it's an EPA mandated DEQ type um, thing that says that because it's not potable water, right?
Right.
And it says that you just can't dump this water on the ground.
Yep.
You have to have a permit. So it's a law. Um, we call our brine, and one of our trademarks is called liquid ore. So if you can't drink it, and this is in one of our early patents, and it's a trademark. And liquid ore says that this is a brine, it's a subsurface brine that we can target and we can explore for, and we can actually react with CO2 and other processes to pull minerals out. And so that's how we do it. And these are all chemical processes. So they're pH swing processes that require, let's just say, ammonium hydroxide in one case. That raises the pH of the brine enough to where the carbon or the calcium molecule gets excited and it wants to join up with the OH negative molecule that is evolved from the ammonium hydroxide and the CO2 that's bubbling up in the reactor, kind of like making beer. You're bubbling CO2 up, and all of a sudden you get this reaction, and the precipitate drops to the bottom, and that is your calcium carbonate or your magnesium carbonate. Those are basically limestone materials. They're a specialty mineral. There's a huge market out there, and you just Google calcium carbonate, and people would be amazed. Calcium carbonate's used in almost everything. Anything that's white, paper stiffener, paint base, caulking that's white. I mean, it's just amazing what the market is. And so, what we've come up with is technically a green way to manufacture calcium carbonate with waste products. Someone else waste we use that, and we take CO2, which is a problem now, and we combine the two to make a valuable product.
And that's great. I appreciate that clarification because I think that helps for listeners. But so I mean, so it's twofold. It's saying I can use this waste product. I can because these metals and minerals are attaching or wanting to be with CO2. I can sequester the CO2 and I can also extract this. Now, what are the volumes of those? Obviously you have patents on exactly how you're extracting that with chemicals. And is there how long does it take? One, and sort of what are the volumes? And can something like this, can we because I want to get into, I want to talk about the technical a little bit more, but I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the market of thinking, what are the volumes we're talking about that you're producing? How long does it take to produce it? And could this really move the needle in the US? And what's the next process once you have this stuff? Where do you take it? Who's the next person the next company that buys this, and does the processing side, and where does it go, et cetera? Does it need to leave the US? I'm curious as to I'm sure these parts of the business, but I would love to understand it better, and I would love listeners to understand it as well.
So, good question. So, volume. So that's key because again, when I mentioned lithium never has a very high concentration as far as parts per million. So the answer to that is to have a big volume of it, right? So
Right.
you have to, and the best thing is to have both. And so in Utah, our prospect that we found just by mining data and looking at old dry holes and looking at water analyses that are out there in their public data, most of this stuff, we found a prospect that we could twin an old dry hole that encountered this brine with, and it was artesian. I mean, there was like more of it coming at them than they really wanted to deal with. Plus, they didn't have the mining permit. So the BLM said, you need to plug this well immediately before it technically blows out. So we got
This is an old oil
the
and gas
mineral
well.
analysis to that water. This is an old oil and gas well drilled in 97.
Right.
And it's very close to the north side of the Paradox Basin. So we said, let's go ahead and twin that well under a mining permit, recover the brine, get the full analysis, and then from there we can build a business model. And we have all these things in places we can sell this brine either as just the brine itself or to use it in a reactor with CO2. Now, to use it in a reactor with CO2 takes additional investment and it takes additional time. But once you do this, it's scalable and it's applicable pretty much anywhere in the United States and Canada. Patents are foreign patents and trademarks, but they're doing it in Canada right now. I mean, they're doing it just above the North Dakota border. Prairie Lithium's doing something similar. They're doing things with CO2, making calcium carbonate down in Australia. They're doing some stuff in the San Antonio area similar to this. So people are doing it, but really the key is volume, and that's where the oil and gas background comes in. As I say, I've worked around oil and gas for 40 years. I know that water's always there. It's just thinking out of the barrel and getting young engineers or middle managers to say, look, this has always been looked at as a waste product that we have to pay $10 a barrel to re-inject and get hauled off or disposed of or reworked or cleaned
Right.
up. What if we can actually make $10 a barrel with this stuff? So that's really kind of the step change in thinking with oil and gas is you can put on the miner's hat once in a while,
Right.
and actually, make limestone.
And the whole idea though from this, and it would be, okay, I have, I'm producing a barrel of oil. I'm getting a barrel of water for the, we're just a 1-to-1 equivalent. I have a barrel of water for every barrel of oil I'm producing, and I have to do something with that. And I've got these RCRA laws, I've got regulations and all this stuff. So, but I have to pay to dispose that. And usually I'm paying, a company to dispose this. I'm doing it myself. Regardless, it's trucking fees. It's a disposal well. The costs add up, especially when things get tight and demand's high. So all those costs add up, and worse probably without inability to find truck drivers, and obviously high fuel costs, all that exacerbates it. So you're still going to have something left over, right? I mean, even if I'm coming to you and saying, okay, hey, I've got all this water now, what can you do? The hope is that there's enough money to be made, that it's going to not only pay for whatever the rest of the water for disposal, but I'm actually going to make some money on it. So this is no longer going to be a cost me, that hopefully there's enough in there. But I'm assuming that, so there's a volume thing with that too. And there has to be enough of these there has to be enough of your magnesium, enough of your lithium, enough of this of your calcium in here to actually, the volume has to matter to actually get the numbers that you want, correct? To make the math actually work.
Right, and it's still all mole chemistry, so it's physical chemistry. Most engineers and obviously chemical engineers take it in college. One of those classes that no one wants, everybody just wants to get through with a C. Well, but it's really pretty cool stuff. It's very simple chemistry in this case. It's been done forever. in manufacturing limestone this way actually reduces typical mined limestone and hauled limestone. Those have a huge carbon footprint. But people accept it because really there's no other way to make cement and different things in different grinds of calcium carbonate. You have to mine it, crush it, transport it, grind it,
Right.
process it. We take all that, we've already got this in solution in the brine. And so it's a unique way of looking at mineral processing. And at the end of the day, we can actually target specific crystal size and get into the high end calcium carbonate market, which is for feed supplements, human drugs and supplements. There's just it's $500 a ton versus if you use it for aggregate, you're looking at $10 a ton. So really, what we hope to do and to commercialize this whole process and make it worthy of actually doing, and not just for the carbon capture stuff, which huge and is so scalable, it's actually going to move the needle. Instead of just putting the CO2 back in the ground and trying to store it, that's the big thing in the Gulf Coast and around Houston,
Right.
and they have the reservoirs to do that. But CO2 being piped all through the oil and gas world in North Dakota, down to the panhandle of Texas, through Colorado, if you can touch CO2 pipeline that's pure CO2 with an oil and gas high water cut field with a good calcium concentration, and most of these brines have that, and we know what they are. We just do the math and figure out, okay, we're going to make 500 tons of this high end calcium carbonate today. Now we got to figure out where we're going to sell it, right?
So it's the
And even if you don't
right.
sell it, it's simply, you get the tax credits. You don't even have to sell it to get the tax credit because you're sequestering the CO2 into something forever, just like when they put it down in the ground and
Right.
underground and store it and monitor it forever. You still get the tax credit. So you don't want to pollute the market, you don't want to destroy a market, but it is a green alternative to mine with a huge carbon footprint. So it's revolutionary, really. But it's thinking outside of the barrel. It's trying to kind of kind of marry oil and gas and mining. And these are all minerals. We
Right.
all go to the same colleges. We all understand the same thing, but we get so focused over our careers, and we need to think out of the barrel a little more. And bring these things to these larger companies that have these ESG goals and have these net zero goals, and this is a solution for them. It really is, and it's right on their back door.
So, I mean, if you've listened to the podcast and you've heard me on things, we can spend some time ripping apart how I feel about ESG. But that being said, we'll table that just for a moment. That being said, so the thinking outside the barrel and conceptually, it's very cool. I mean, it's nerdy and cool, and hence PetroNerds podcast. So from a nerdy perspective, I totally get it. And I think when you're measuring, I mean, I do think some of the stuff is predicated on regulations, right? So and it seems like some of the stuff is predicated on, I mean, every carbon business right now and green business right now has been predicated on Biden coming to office and signing the Paris Climate Accords and putting executive orders in place. So there's politically some of the stuff I feel like, at least, I wouldn't say carbon sequestration is going away, but in terms of the pushing on the net zero goals and stuff, especially for oil and gas operators, that's a bit tricky. And I do think that could be transitory from an investor pressure standpoint, or at least change and adapt and alter itself. But in terms of, it seems to me like, yes, you can advertise lithium and, other metals and minerals that are sexy, but really it's about calcium carbonate, and it's really the ability to sort of work. And I would say, I'm not sure the word easier to sequester is, but that it's technically doable. And that, how are you measuring? Do you have accurate ways of measuring the amount of carbon that's being sequestered, and how much is it? So if I'm producing a barrel of oil, like, what's the equivalent if I have a barrel of water being produced, and how much am I sequestering, and how much calcium carbonate am I getting, and then am I selling that calcium carbonate to someone for cement?
Okay, so let me just give you an example of a project in Utah. If I have 3,000 barrels a day of this brine, okay, and this brine is 135,000 part per million calcium as a chloride. So it's basically a saturated brine that you could use for ice control and dust control. So it's that type of it's a rare product to be an artesian well flowing this. So I can sequester with 3,200 barrels a day of that brine in a reactor using our process. I can sequester 2 million cubic feet of CO2 a day. Okay. And that's significant. That's a large volume of CO2. And essentially, over a year's time, that's 30,000 metric tons of CO2. So the annual threshold for carbon sequestration tax credits on Section 45Q is currently 25,000 metric tons.
Okay.
So that's kind of a base case. So then I'm going to end up with, 80,000 pounds a day of this high-end calcium carbonate. So that's if the reaction is a 95%, you know, complete reaction.
Right.
So any CO2 that doesn't get reacted, they just recycle back
Okay.
through. And in this process has been done in labs many times. There's a book that I have purchased that talks about a lot of this stuff. It's called CO2 sequestration by ex situ mineral carbonation. And people have studied this forever. We're actually working with a Stevens Institute back in New Jersey on a DOE project that's going to take that lab scale carbon sequestration, mineral carbonation, making calcium on a bench, or take it to the field. And so we're looking for a strategic partner that has a brine that's an oil field brine in North Dakota. Let's say it's 1,000 barrels a day. We're going to do a pilot test there. And that's where you basically prove up, do your demonstration scale.
Right.
From there, the next stage is commerciality. So we're moving down that road. It's a long process. I mean, that's going to be a 3-year project that'll start first of next year. But it's $2.5 million project. We're going to build a little pilot unit. Let's say it looks like it's 10 by 5 foot. It looks like a treater, an oil field separator. But we can do that on site. It's mobile. We can take it to where the CO2 is, where the brine is. And like I say, once you do that, then you can look at the crystal structure and actually take and look at the value, and actually make a business case for scaling this up and make it commercial. So whether or not all this stuff is transitory or not, if you can commercialize the process, who doesn't want to make money, right? Who
Right.
doesn't want another revenue stream? So that's really our goal.
Right. So you're saying, I mean, hey, I have this tax credit now on CO2. So in theory, I can get that up to a threshold. But even if I can't get that, I'm still getting this calcium carbonate. I'm still doing the CO2 thing. We're meeting goals that the companies have saying they're hit. But you will still have, and this is, we're going to shift gears here and get into the market before we close on a discussion. But you still have water that you have to dispose of. So does any of this make it easier or better for on the regulatory side of that disposal? Because as we mentioned before, part of even just using recycled water or produced water that's recycled for fracking, that took regulatory shifts within Texas to change to ability to move this stuff around to do basic, simple filtration. I would say simple. I'm oversimplifying it, but to do filtration processes. So does this help with any of that? And I mean, and do you still have a ton of water left over? Because I would say that's something that, from a business standpoint, when you're working with operators and service companies, it's sort of like this is the stuff that moves the needle quickly. So does it help with that? Does it reduce the volumes, or are we still left with a ton of water?
I think, logically, it's going to, if you're taking something out of the brine, you're going to have less volume, but it's not,
right.
It's not going to say, okay, we're still going to re-inject it, or we're still going to haul it off the same way we already have, because let's just say you're reducing your volume by 5%. So, I mean, that changes day to day with just normal operation. So that's not a big concern. The only issue would be if like this Utah project. So it's a grassroots well, right? And so there is no disposal system there now. So what we have left, we'll call it the soup. It's going to have, it's going to be rich in chlorides. It's going to be, it's probably going to have to be hauled to a disposal site. And there's several of them nearby, actually. Or we'll drill a disposal well and permitted class 2 injection, so UIC program. So we're not concerned about that. That's typical mines like potash mining, they have that issue. They're big in Utah in that same area. So um, yeah, I mean, we're really not changing anything different other than trying to extract another, another cut, say out of the fluid that's being produced out of the
Right.
ground or being handled anyway.
Right. And so your pilot project that you want your pilot project to be in Utah, but your ideal situation is is using produced water from, say, the Bakken in North Dakota, which you'd basically
Yep.
have a little, I'm assuming, little facility or mobile facility that you're able to do that with, or is this going to be would this need to be a permanent
Right.
facility?
We'd love, no, so we can do the pilot can be done anywhere, and we'd love to do it in North Dakota because that brings in, one of the operators up there. It basically says, okay, if operator A can do it, and then that means that operator BC and on down the line can do it, right? Because water's water. It's just so we've been talking to some of the major operators up there, and we're keen to get in with one of them, and show them what we have. We have this DOE project that's going to require access to, and I think once we get that announced, it's going to be fairly simple to get one of these operators to jump in.
Okay. So we're gonna. This is perfect segue on the switching gears on the market side, because you're trying to get an operator interested in this. You're saying, hey, we're sequestering the carbon, so we got these credits there. If you're not already doing that, so that's beneficial there from just a tax credit standpoint. Also, if they have lofty ESG goals and trying to hit net zero targets, which I think are ridiculous, but regardless, they're trying to do that. So this helps them in that way to actually hit from a carbon sequester side. This is beneficial, but the byproducts that we're getting, this carbon or this calcium carbonate and hopefully and potentially other byproducts as you're sort of advertising, is that how much, where are they going? How much do I get for them? How much am I getting, for that calcium carbonate? What's the market like for that? And, is North Dakota, are we going to have a ton of calcium carbonate and then it's got to get to places where we're obviously, needing that cement and building stuff. So what's the, on the market side of that, those byproducts that we're getting, and I'm assuming, we're getting much less lithium and things like that, but still those would, you would try to do something with that and get them to market. But it's really, that seems to be the biggest piece. How much are we getting and where does it need to go?
Well, we can get a lot of it. I mean, it's the thing is, logistics are always key, obviously.
There.
You want to be located on rail, you want to be near interstate highways, but anything that's mined has to be moved, right? And
Right.
so, typical low grade calcium carbonate used for aggregate in cement. So, a concrete slurry is 80% aggregate and 20% cement.
Okay.
A lot of people don't realize that. So, and everything's built with concrete, right?
Right.
So, there's a huge market, there's always roads being built. And so, there's your market for the low grade stuff. I mean, just even if you're getting $10, a ton, you're still getting $10 a ton, right?
Right.
You're not having to pay for someone to take it away. So there's that. Now, if we do this test and go after the high grade crystal, and that's really what we're doing with these Stevens Institute and some of these folks, the labs, the national labs, is going after something that's a green alternative to mining a mountain. Let's just say, I mean, there's companies in Switzerland, Omnia is one of them. You've got Imerys, these foreign countries that they've been mining marble in the Alps since the 1500s. I mean, you have to have it. And so we have an alternative to actually open pit mines in that huge carbon footprint, and we can come up with the same quality of that high grade $500 a ton calcium carbonate. That's really that's really what we're after is because we don't want it. You don't want to sell it other than for the fact, that if you sequester the CO2 and that's your game and that's what you're all about, you can sell it for $10 a ton and be happy. You're getting your tax credits. You're getting $10 a ton. There's a lot of it. But in the end of the day, you really want to go after the high end product, because then if you have to end up hauling it from, say, eastern Utah all the way to Arizona, you can pay for that trucking versus, maybe they're getting their calcium carbonate in Arizona. So it's all in supply chain and the cost of fuel, it all comes in. But mines are, no one's going to mine next to a factory. We know that. So they
Right.
do have to load it and they have to haul it. And
So
so,
I would say that, and I'm glad you clarified that, because I would say even, and that's probably something that needs to be emphasized a little bit more is you know, you're talking about aggregate, which is 80% of, you're saying, of that cement slurry. And that's what you're producing, is that calcium carbonate that goes to that. And you're doing that through a process, one, that can actually sequester the carbon, and two, you're getting this byproduct out. And so there's benefits to that. How much exactly you're getting and how that dense the market is, obviously a scale question of how much you'd be doing through this. But yes, that is an outside, to quote you, I mean, that's an outside the barrel way of thinking in terms of, I can get this byproduct. I think some difficulties in the market thinking about that is that, from an economic standpoint, one, when your economy is rip roaring, it's great. You definitely need cement. And you're right. Even if it's not rip roaring, you're using it for everything. So, and it's an important thing to have. Economies using, and the CO2 side, in when people talk about CO2 emissions, cement is a big, big factor. I mean, it's a huge, it's a huge emitter of CO2. So that's sort of the, I think,
yes.
cement and CO2 are something that people have to understand. Then too, I think having, because the oil and gas industry is so separate from that. I mean, yes, I'm sure there are people in real estate and people that touch it and everything, but I mean, oil and gas folks are focused on drilling and producing oil and gas, and focused on the commodity world and what's going on. So this is a sort of a separate way of thinking about this byproduct and CO2. And even, I would say, most people in the industry, yes, everyone's talking ESG, everyone's talking about CO2, but deeply understanding it and understanding what they do. So I would say those are some things to, marrying it together and understanding, which I think are very interesting. But that gets us to a nice, shifting gears a little bit in terms of, and this is slightly different than I thought it would be, talking about lithium and everything, but I think it's great, much better that we clarified aggregate, cement, CO2, and, as opposed to actually mining it. So I think that's great clarification. I mean, in terms of the market, I mean, you're starting this business, you're a small business owner like myself. So the market, the reason the Dow is down today, the reason the market is off, the reason oil prices are well below $100 a barrel right now, not well below, but just under $100 a barrel right now, is because of real fears of recession, that not fears of them that were basically there. That, I mean, Dollar Tree and dollar store companies are the outperforming today, because that's what performs well in a recession. And the concerns about spending are serious. I mean, and we're sort of hitting a double. I would say it's a multifold, triple-edged whammy that, in the presentation I gave at the Doug conference last week, I sort of spoke to all these points. But we have very high natural gas prices, which I think are already shoving Europe into recession. We have a war. We have food and energy crisis. We have rampant inflation across the globe on everything. And so it's not just oil prices, but I keep hearing people on CNBC today saying, well, if oil prices go down, that's a 50-cent savings on gasoline, and that could curb this. And I thought, look, oil prices going down is a product of, if that's a product of people, doing less, which will eventually hit jet fuel, and people will fly less, and it will eventually hit diesel, and people will be doing stuff less. It kind of does have an impact to your business. And I'm not ixnaying it, saying it's bad, but it's tricky in the timing of bringing up businesses and stuff, of being timing and getting it going. But just curious as your thoughts on, as a business owner, and what you're doing and getting it's all applicable, and you have a lot of passion for this. The thoughts on the market and recession and your business and how that all fits together, and what's your perspective on that?
Well, I think, being in oil and gas for 40 years, I've seen, since got in 81, I saw the dust of 86 in Denver. It was just, it's cyclical, but people need a couple things. If it's not mined, it's got to be grown, right? We got to eat, and everything else comes from mining, whether in mining is oil and gas production, it's mineral extraction. So those cement's been around since early Roman days and early days in England. Those processes are just, they're the basics of life. And especially you go
literally
down to
building.
Mexico,
Yep.
yeah, everything you're building in Mexico, all those resorts in Cabo, they're nonstop, and then you see the cement plants, and it's there. And we're never going to stop doing that. We got to live somewhere. So I really think we're in a neat spot. We touch all this, whether you believe in it or not. The CO2 thing. We're there. If someone wants that, and we have that.
Mm-hmm.
We have a way to make these green products and actually do something that people want to do as far as CO2 sequestration. And it's just what nature does on its own. We're just accelerating it. It's basically, Mammoth Hot Springs in Yellowstone, those terraces, those travertine terraces are essentially, they take, hundreds of thousands of years to build up. We're doing that in minutes, because their CO2 level is the atmosphere's CO2 level, 0.05%. We're using 99% CO2. So just that's the whole
Yep.
gig. And that's how we speed it up. And it's when you think about it, I mean, it's so basic and it makes so much sense, and people say, well, how can you do that? Well, how does nature do it?
Right.
We're just doing one of nature's project processes, and it we can capture a lot of CO2. I mean, we're not just going to stuff it in the ground and have to monitor. I think that's really where, I know people, oil and gas folks, think it's cool because, yeah, we get to find a reservoir and we already know where those are. And we get to drill wells. That's all fun and great, but you're going to own that CO2
Yep.
for a long, long time. And I'd rather see it in a road, in a new road projects, and put a big sign up on the interstate and say, this road from here to Cheyenne sequestered this many metric tons of CO2 in this road. I mean, and we're driving on it.
Yeah.
We're not, worried about it coming out of the boogeyman coming out of the ground and killing us, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, and we're using.
So
I mean, I think that's a great example, and I also think that that, which is why the differentiated view I have on ESG. I think the sort of understanding what, or the real ESG of understanding, taking out just being just the E and realizing that this is a holistic perspective, and doing business right is different from investing in stuff, and having a business case is different than just fanfare and hand waving on I have a net zero plan and I'm just doing it so I get into some portfolio or whatever, and it's not actually doing anything. And it's to the points I said and to what Chris Wright also said at Doug last week was that too many people in this industry have leaned into that narrative and are not helping the oil and gas industry. But your business and this example of it is a great way to say is to be thinking outside the box from a differentiated, as I would call it, a differentiated view on ESG. So if you can build a product if you can build a product with using, instead of sequestering your CO2, but you can actually create something with it and build something with it, and then say, hey, as part of the oil and gas industry, we've not only done this, but we've made something with it in additional. That's a win-win. That's double fold. That's more than I just got rid of my carbon because you told me to and you're paying me to do it. It's I did that and I built something with it in a product that we actually need. So I'm actually doing things, and I think that's where truthfully, if that's where the objectives are, that's where the business has to go, is to have these multifold solutions. And usually that's why I brought up the 2014 thing, is that it takes economic downturns and pivots to create this. I mean, I believe in 2008 when we had our major recession. I remember hearing, and I studied that and was part of it and felt it, but a lot of people weren't actually recycling a good amount of metal and stuff that, I mean, if you're making I think it was stereos I'd heard about, of speakers, listening of speakers and all the stuff that goes into them. There was so much byproduct and so much shavings and so much cuttings that people weren't saving. And then obviously, prices go through the roof, or people don't have enough money. Of two things, if you have a surge in prices, one, that helps from a recycling standpoint, or saving, or reusing, or using the scraps or whatever. But two, it's also from a, hey, the economy is down, so we need to save and, on a cost as much as we can. And so it's usually things that force them, you have economic forces that usually drive a push for change. Sometimes you can have the regulatory side that helps, but typically, the market has to want to do it in some way. The market has to want to do it, and this seems like one of those opportunities that, hey, if especially if the prices are right and you get it to a scaled position, that from both a CO2 standpoint, but also making something standpoint, and hitting these goals, that you might have a win-win here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think. I mean, I challenge people to question what we're trying to do. I mean, I think we touch, like I say, we touch all the hot buttons with whatever side you lean. We all have our backgrounds to reconcile, but I really believe, truthfully, that we're not doing. I'm doing that. I don't need to do this. I'm doing this because I want to set an example to show that here's a guy that's been in oil and gas for 40 years, retired, saw the fracking revolution, the horizontal thing, bought and sold properties, instead of just retiring, riding off on my motorcycle, I'm willing to step in and try to share some knowledge and bring a team together that shares that same passion. And I love going to the colleges and talking to
Hmm.
the kids because they dig it. They get
Yep.
right into it because they've not been in these blinders
Absolutely.
for 10, 20 years. I mean, they're fresh and they did, mind the brine. It's
Yep.
like they just eat it up. So I'm going to continue to do that. And I appreciate again with your, podcast here. I think it's just, just kind of a steamroll for us. So
Yeah. Well, no,
I'm
it's
really excited about it. And there's a
absolutely.
lot of things we haven't talked about yet, the whole geothermal piece, but that's for another day, I think.
Yeah, well, I think so. I think it's a nerdy topic. It's been awesome to have you on the podcast, and I completely agree. I mean, when you're talking to students, and I think that's why I say getting you sort of out of your own comfort zone in terms of mining is not something I think the oil and gas industry typically doesn't think of themselves as miners, but they are. I mean, that's what you're doing with. It's just it's natural gas or crude oil, so it's a bit different. I mean, in the oil sands, obviously, in Canada, that's actually mining. 20% of that on the surface, that's actually
Mhm.
mining, and then upgrading it. So it's all very interrelated, and regardless of whether it's lithium or whatever it is, but really, I think more clarity it's clarified for me more about the cement side, the aggregate, and the actual calcium carbonate, and what you're actually trying to do, and a multifold solution. And I think like anything, business is it's a little bit trickier. I mean, we love the idea of refracking, like is a perfect example. It's great. We'll bet we have refract, we'll continue, but it hasn't gone, scalable because there's different market forces and conventional thinking and how folks think about stuff. But it usually there's, it's people in the industry, it's tipping points, there's a lot of nuances to this business. And you're obviously deep in those nuances and working through it. So it's cool business. Wish you the best of luck, and absolutely, we'll have you back, and we'll have to talk about other multi aspects of this. I haven't got into geothermal on the podcast, and I would love to. So we will table that one for another day.
Wonderful. It's great talking to you today.